Half empty or half full? Heck, why not both? It's time to mark 3, the halfway point of Master System.
Attention! Do not panic!
By my reckoning, we are just about at the midway point of our journey through the Master System library. Now that we've come this far, why not stop, look back, and examine the best and worst that the system has had to offer so far. Let's start by counting down the 10 best titles to have appeared on Master System so far. According to me, at least. But if you're not interested in my opinion, either to agree with or get angry about, why are you even watching my channel? I generally don't love light gun games, and Sega's in particular tended to be difficult to love. Their Master System light phaser titles were usually as literal as their names. Shooting gallery, safari hunt, trap shooting. Just simple, straightforward games where you point a gun at a screen and shoot stuff. It was mildly diverting, but not really life-changing in any meaningful way, and not really the kind of thing that merits jumping through all the hoops of getting light gun tech up and running in the modern age. With the exception of Gangster Town, the finest of Master System light gun titles. Unlike most of the other shooting games on Master System, Gangster Town doesn't simply plop you down in a static space as targets stream across the screen. Each stage has its own dynamic personality and character, ranging from a car chase to blasting through an illegal speakeasy. It's loaded with personality, too. Sure, you're zapping legions of identical pinstriped thugs, but there are lots of other diversions to gun for at the same time. And you even get points for taking out the angels that depart the gangsters' bodies when they die. A fun twist on a Sega trademark. Well, fun for you. Sucks for the bad guys that you've apparently doomed to an eternity of hell. It even has a level up system that awards you more health for effective shooting, and multiplayer support. Actually, that might be the one real flaw of Gangster Town. It's so proud of its simultaneous multiplayer support that playing solo becomes almost impossible. I will never see Stage 4 unless I buy a second light phaser and make a friend, which, honestly, I'll never do. But those first few stages are good enough that I don't mind. As an action puzzle game on SG-1000, the original Doki Doki Penguin Land punched above its weight class with unusually refined controls, physics, and exceptional depth of play. As a sequel on Master System, Penguin Land works even better. The improved console tech of course results in a nicer looking and sounding game, but the real boost here comes in the form of the save feature. Penguin Land has battery backup, which means that for the first time in an American console title, you could actually save all the custom levels you designed. But even if you didn't spend time in the stage editor, Penguin Land offered plenty to do. Dozens of stages revolving around cute critters and nuanced play physics. What's not to like? Maze Hunter 3D doesn't feel entirely like a fully completed game. It's all kind of samey, and there are no bosses or unique challenges for those who tackle its 20 stages. What you do find here, however, is pretty great. A top-down action game that makes interesting use of the Master System 3D glasses to create a sense of depth and multiplanar action. Maze Hunter 3D introduced visual tricks that would become common years later on Virtual Boy and 3DS. In the modern age, Maze Hunter 3D probably would have arrived as a roguelite. A contemporary sequel probably would have introduced more fully developed mechanics, like power-up systems and that sort of thing. But despite its limits, there's something really compelling about this maze-wandering journey where you spend all your time pounding the crap out of three-dimensional bad guys with a stick. Let's get this out of the way right up front. Alex Kidd in Miracle World does that Master System thing where the action buttons are reversed from the way they work on pretty much any other console and in pretty much any other arcade game. That makes it pretty annoying to play today. It also has a lot of other annoying flaws, like fairly primitive control physics and a reliance on hidden items. And don't forget the unforgiving puzzle-like ending sequence, which requires you to pull together a bunch of details and execute them flawlessly. A real kick to the teeth for anyone who actually managed to get that far into the game. What Alex Kidd in Miracle World also has is moxie, spunk, chutzpah. This is a game that knows what it wants to be, even if it's not entirely successful at being that thing. And that thing is a rambling platform action-adventure filled with secrets and challenges. Actually, what it wants to be is a Dragon Ball game. That didn't pan out, so instead it's more like the house brand Dragon Ball, Great Value Dragon Ball, Sam's Club Dragon Ball, Goku by way of Kirkland. But compared to other licensed anime games of the era, it's a masterpiece. Certainly, it was memorable enough to launch Alex's brief turn as a console mascot and inspire a modern remake, and that's not nothing. A rare case of an arcade game that turned out better on Master System than in its original incarnation. Action Fighter takes a gimmicky combat driving game and turns it into a Spy Hunter clone that out-Spy Hunter's Spy Hunter. Beginning as a fairly straightforward game about driving and shooting, Action Hunter literally transforms into a convincing Xevious clone after a while. It has a challenging yet reasonable difficulty level, it looks nice, it controls well, and the stages offer a respectable degree of variety from one to the other, all the way to the showdowns that stand in for boss battles. Does Action Fighter change the world? Does it reinvent video games? Nah, but it's a damn good shooter on a system made for action, and that's all it really needs to be. The exception to the aforementioned rule that anime-licensed games of this era generally disappointed, Zillian stands out by daring to be different. Well, daring to be different unless you're a fan of Epyx's Impossible Mission, which Zillian cheerfully rips off without a hint of apology. And that's okay. More games should have ripped off Impossible Mission, to be honest. And Zillian takes advantage of its licensed status to improve on the game that inspired it. You initially play as the cartoon's inexplicable point of view character, a low-achieving goofball named JJ who somehow, nevertheless, is the star member of the noble White Knights team. But along the way you rescue his teammates, which gives you the ability to switch over to play as them as well. And since the entire premise of the TV series hung on the light phaser-looking space gun Zillian, you get to use the upgradable Zillian in-game to gun down bad guys instead of just somersaulting over them as an Impossible Mission. It's a big game that demands a lot from players with its limited continue options, but it's one of those games where you get a little further every time you play, so it feels satisfying. And you always need to be on your toes through every playthrough, since the solutions to each puzzle room change randomly with each new game. That is to say, it gets easier, but it's never a gimme. Fantasy Zone: The Maze doesn't really look much like Fantasy Zone at first glance. It's like a Pac-Man clone, not a Defender clone. What nonsense! This Fantasy Zone spin-off digs deep into Sega's arcade and console legacy to build on the ancient Head-On and Pac-R rather than being a shooter. Somehow though, it still manages to be intrinsically Fantasy Zone-like. Heck, the arcade version was called Opa Opa. It's not just the aesthetics of the thing, though certainly it captures the vibrant whimsy of Sega's premier toroid shooter franchise. Look more closely, and you'll see all kinds of familiar elements. A coin-based economy that enables temporary power-ups, load-bearing boss enemies that soak up damage and dispense little guys, and weirdo weapon upgrades that you wouldn't find in any other shooter. Fantasy Zone: The Maze also juices up its action by incorporating a stage timer, something not found in either Pac-R or Fantasy Zone. The timer doesn't limit how long you can hang out in a level, though you do earn cash for speedy completion. Rather, it simply determines when minor enemies spawn, and forces you to pay attention to more than just gobbling dots and evading monsters. There's a lot happening here, and it all works together brilliantly. Better than it probably should. It's an addictive, fast-paced, challenging action game, and it supports 2-player mode for that extra twist of quality. What does it say about a game when a company creates an entire peripheral to support it? I mean, if the company in question is Nintendo, it says nothing much except that you're going to be stuck with a junky piece of plastic that won't work with any other software. In the case of Outrun, though, things shook out differently. Sega knew that a big part of what made Outrun so compelling in the first place was its stellar city pop soundtrack. So, they created an add-on module for the Japanese Mark III console that enabled Yamaha-powered FM synthesis, a scaled-down version of the arcade sound tech, and a sample, not literally, of what was to come with Sega Genesis. Admittedly, we didn't get the FM synth add-on for the US or Europe to enhance the audio of subsequent carts here. The trade-off for Japan not having light phaser support, I suppose. I can tell you which I'd rather have had, though I guess I don't need to since I capture all of my game footage from a Japanese console that enables the FM audio that Sega left buried in the code of localized games, despite the lack of official support for FM audio in the English language carts. Sega doesn't always do the right thing, they try to make good in small ways. And it's hard not to love them when they deliver a game like Outrun. Yeah, fine, Outrun doesn't quite capture the speed or visuals of the arcade version. And even the enhanced FM synth is lackluster compared to the coin-op machine's output. But who cares? This is a classic driving game captured as well as any 8-bit console in 1987 could have managed. You get the branching paths, the relentless timer, the increasingly dizzying roads, and all the great tunes. If you have one of those SG-1000 racing controllers that only shipped in Japan, you can even approach it like a real racer. Yeah, I realize that a lot of the charm points I'm outlining for the Master System version of Outrun rely on Japan-only enhancements, but even for someone who doesn't like racing games, like me, it's the kind of game that makes you want to go the extra mile, so to speak, to squeeze the best experience out of the cart. Really, either Wonder Boy could go on this list, but I didn't want it to be mostly just Fantasy Zone and Wonder Boy. And the original Wonder Boy showed up on NES under a different name and with slightly friendlier design choices, so let's go with the sequel. Like so many other games on Master System, Wonder Boy and Monsterland began life in arcades. Unlike so many other games on Master System, it works better here than it did in arcades. That's because this was one of those works that attempted to make an action RPG setup work in a coin-op environment, which it's kind of tough. But in a home setup, it's pretty great. And unlike Action Fighter, it didn't need to be reinvented. This emerged as a pretty straightforward coin-op conversion, adjusted to meet the needs of a less powerful chipset, but otherwise quite faithful. That includes the complete lack of continues, which admittedly is something that probably should have been tweaked. Wonder Boy and Monsterland is a big, compelling game, but it's pretty tough, and needs to give players a little more than 3 lives before kicking them back to the title screen to start over again. Sega, and I guess Westone, were still operating in an arcade-first mindset here, which does dull the shine of this otherwise brilliant action-adventure classic somewhat. It can be a real bummer to get well into the game, only to have a nasty surprise end your run, forcing you to start all over. Especially since the more you replay the early stages, the more you realize how prescribed the overall design actually is despite its apparent action RPG trappings. Still, it's a standout title regardless, and it paved the way for a game that has a damn good chance of coming in at number 1 in my inevitable list of best releases from the back half of the Master System library. And finally, the title of Best Card on Master System to this point in the Segaiden chronology belongs to none other than Fantasy Zone 2, The Tears of Opa Opa. This one really showcases what made Sega and Master System so different from Nintendo and NES. The games that show up on NES Best of lists tend to be pretty predictable, probably because those games helped define entire genres in the first place. Fantasy Zone 2, on the other hand, has rarely been imitated or duplicated. Building on the original Fantasy Zone, the sequel retained its fundamental gameplay loop, literally a loop, shooting across infinite loops of stage space. But it added more of a console sensibility to the design by linking multiple substages together in each level. The need to duck between multiple loops in search of targets, cache, shops, and boss gates added just the right amount of substance to Fantasy Zone's design to make it more than just a simple arcade shooter, not that you could really describe the original as such. Fantasy Zone 2 builds on the original's economy, power-ups, and frantic patterns. It's a high-energy shoot-'em-up whose cute appearance belies its skull-crunching difficulty level, and that rules. Honorable mentions for this list include Ghost House. While not quite a top 10er, Ghost House deserves respect for making the best of its format. There wasn't a whole lot of storage space on those little Sega cards, but Ghost House managed to pull off a convincing little platform action game packed with secrets and variety all the same. It's a pity the clunky controls make it so hard. There's Black Belt, another one of those anime-based games. Black Belt started life as a Fist of the North Star game that absolutely shamed the god-awful mess that we got as a Fist tie-in on NES. This release might actually have made the cut if it had stuck to its origins, but something more than a Kenshiro sprite was lost in translation. And then there's Alien Syndrome. Alien Syndrome didn't have much of a shot of recreating the arcade original on the underpowered Master System, but it delivered a convincing effort all the same. Changing up the overall flow and balance of the game resulted in a maze shooter that worked well on consoles, even if it didn't live up to the original. The lack of multiplayer really hurt. So those were the best Master System games so far, but what about the worst? There have been some real stinkers on the system, but I don't want this series to become too bogged down by negativity, so we're going to look at only 5 of the duds. It can be a little hard to parse exactly what makes a game bad, so this isn't necessarily a condemnation of design, tech, or programming. Rather, this bottom 5 is about vibes, the overall feeling that the game left me with. I Want to Like Rescue Mission, an attempt to mix up the light gun format with a very different take on the term rail shooter. Protecting a small squad of aid workers as they attempt to triage wounded soldiers via handcar is a compellingly weird concept, and the speed of the action and the minor differences between the 3 squad members add a lot to an already unconventional mix. Unfortunately, this one is let down by its tech, the light phaser. For whatever reason, this game is incredibly difficult to get working correctly and often fails to read the light gun's targeting. I struggled to get it up and running for my retrospective and ended up roping in external help. They had trouble too, and found that Master System fans generally report this as the most difficult light gun game to get working right, even on original hardware. If this were some sketchy unlicensed title, that might be understandable, but this thing was programmed by Sega, the people who made the console and the light phaser, so what the heck? I'm not a fan of most of Sega's misnamed great sports games, but there is a special place in hell for great volleyball, an absolute chore of an experience. I get that volleyball is a difficult sport to translate into video game form, but this effort doesn't even clear the lowest bar of minimal competence. Avoid. It looked great on paper. Space Harrier, using the 3D glasses to make up for the Master System's inability to properly simulate the superscalar hardware. In practice, it's pretty rough. The issue comes down to the use of background tiles to depict most in-game graphics. Since all of the objects flying out at you from a distance are baked into the background tiles and can't overlap one another the way sprites can, your brain is forced to attempt to reconcile inconsistent shapes and objects as 3-dimensional elements. But your brain is pretty smart and wants nothing to do with such nonsense. Worse, the alternating lens tech of the 3D glasses requires the game to effectively display graphics at half the usual frame rate. The result is a seemingly sensible idea that doesn't work at all, a genuine headache of a video game. I almost like My Hero. When you beat a boss, your character sits down and delivers an inspiring speech to his defeated foe while gesturing at the sunset. That's great. But good luck getting that far. My Hero hits you with fast, relentless foes that can take you out in a single hit and have attack priority over you. Single hit kills by constant enemies makes for a real slog of a game, a test of patience, one that would suck even if you could complete the first level, because there wasn't room on the Sega card for all the other stages. Cool. Of all Master System releases, you do not want to play F-16 Fighting Falcon the most. It's an overly complicated game that pairs an elaborate 2-controller input scheme with the worst graphics on the system. That's not an exaggeration. F-16 Fighting Falcon is actually an SG-1000 game running in disguise as a Master System title. It looks the part, with simple visuals and a terrible frame rate. Mission objectives are opaque. On-screen objects are poorly rendered. Controls are a mess. Everything about it is bad. However, it is a weirdly interesting game that demonstrates way more ambition than its sub-mediocre content would suggest. F-16 Fighting Falcon lets you play head-to-head multiplayer on 2 screens with 2 systems if you build your own link cable and plug it into a collection of esoteric SG-1000 accessories. To my knowledge, no other Master System game lets you do this. I mean, why would they? The entire process is too clumsy to bear considering. But it exists, and is squandered on this lackluster flight combat sim rather than something more interesting. Weird, and somehow a perfectly appropriate epitaph for this miserable little game. Next time on Segaiden, exploring the secret arts of ninjutsu and real estate.